Hi, I am Naomi Reeves. I am an infrastructure engineer with Target, and I joined Target in 2013. But before that, I actually spent 10 years in nonprofits, where I was a technology geek embedded inside of a business team. In IT terms, I was that nightmare end user who was programming Access databases and running them locally on my machine. If you have a SharePoint implementation, you're probably familiar with that really strange info path form that nobody really knows how to support. I wrote it. Thankfully, my app design and documentation skills have improved since then. But my journey to automation actually started there. You see, I am actually really bad at repeatable tasks. If I have to do something more than 3 times, I am already starting to figure out how I'm going to write myself out of the process through automation. And that's how I actually was introduced to SharePoint. As an end user who was actually actively hacking it to automate my business processes. So when I joined Target in 2013, I was actually in a similar role, but in 2015, I actually transitioned over and formally joined IT and started working with Ron on a team managing the infrastructure of Target SharePoint environment.
So that's me, Ron. I jokingly say that my parents were ahead of their times by raising me cage-free and on the farm, until my wife said that pasture-raised is the new thing now. But I thought that didn't really go so well, so I stuck with cage-free here. But I do bring up the farm because farms have complex problems that need engineered solutions at times, and I like to think of that as where my engineering roots kind of really began. I mentioned my wonderful wife. I also have 3 great kids who also require engineered solutions at times. I spent 15 years in IT. Started off as a developer, admin, architect, engineer. And what I really like about Chef and InfraCode is it really allows us to combine all those roles, and so I like that a lot. I work for Target. Naomi works for Target. Here's a slide about Target. Target's a big retailer, Fortune 50 big. Lots of stores, lots of distribution centers, lots of team members. There's an online business at Target.com. And these are lots of things that you might already know. But Target has also been making some recent investment in innovations, and specifically they've partnered with Techstars to bring 10 startups into the Minneapolis area to really accelerate retail innovation. If you're a fan of Internet of Things, Target has Open House in San Francisco, which is an experimental store for the connected home. So if you live there, stop by and check us out. Or if you're one of the guests that are participating in the LA 25 initiative, there's 25 stores in LA where really there's some innovation pipeline there that's testing, trying to aim to bring the guest retail experience to the next level. So Target does big things, and that's the same for the internal system. So we work on an internal infrastructure team supporting our corporate and marketing teams. It's a big portfolio, complex, running on pretty much every platform. And Chef plays an important strategic role for us in managing that infrastructure. And maybe someday we'll be lucky enough to come back and tell you a different story about a different platform. But today's story is about SharePoint.
So I joined this community about a year ago, and at my first DevOps meetup, I actually had this exchange.
Name tag. Hi, Naomi. I see you work for Target. So what do you do?
I'm an infrastructure engineer with Target, but I primarily work with SharePoint.
SharePoint? You must be the most hated person here, and I work in security.
Now, I'm no stranger to SharePoint sucks, but hated, this was definitely something new. So I dug in and I took a look at the modern software development and deployment patterns and realized that beyond the general usability complaints that I had heard from people, this was really rooted in a lot of the configuration tools and how we could start managing the massive scales of this particular monolithic application. So, not to be deterred, I actually decided that we should really try and figure out how to do this because we had so many things that really required our attention and focus. So I can say that hope remains. It is possible to automate SharePoint. But to understand our story, you're going to have to know a little bit more about SharePoint and our business case for it.
So we all know that SharePoint is easy to pick on, but the reality is that it and packaged software like it does remain critical for corporations. This is a quote from Seth Patton, who's a senior global product marketing manager for SharePoint and OneDrive for Microsoft. And last year at MS Ignite, he stated that 80% of Fortune 500 companies are still running SharePoint on-prem. And so it's important, but what is it? Right now, Microsoft's talking about it as being a team empowerment platform for individuals, teams, and organizations to organize content and share, collaborate on content. And some common uses for that are really around like your corporate intranets, your team collaboration sites, and search. And originally, it was one of those kind of Swiss Army knife platforms that really tried to enable self-service and take IT out of traditional IT roles. And that's how Naomi got introduced to the platform and eventually moved into an infrastructure team supporting it. So what are the building blocks and the configuration management challenges with SharePoint? I like to simplistically break it down by logical and physical components. So on logical, the easiest thing to start with is really our files. Files roll up into sites, and sites roll up into web applications. And web applications expose services to sites via service application connections. And then depending on how you build all these building blocks together, the whole logical construct is really that farm. And so these farm components and logical components map to physical counterparts. And so if you just call out, so I have kind of two big roles. There's like a web app server role here and a SQL server role. So that's some of the role stuff. And then the farm itself also maps down into what's called a configuration database. So you may be wondering if SharePoint has its own configuration database and its own configuration management, why would you need Chef? Well, there's some challenges that are associated with that. And the main thing is that there are a bunch of components that are outside of the scope of SharePoint management. In addition, it's packaged software, a black box. There's a powerful set of PowerShell commands that you can use, but it still remains sorry. It still remains where configuration drift can be introduced into the platform easily. And so Naomi will show you a little bit later on how we use Chef to really manage both the managed and unmanaged components of SharePoint. And you can understand how even in an environment, even in a small environment, how this could be a problem. Well, it becomes more of a problem once we get into the scale, the size of target. So keep in mind that these are just essentially production counts. So a lot of these environments themselves actually have 4, sometimes even more lower level environments to support the development pipeline. And so that becomes a really big problem with trying to maintain consistent configuration and testing. And on top of that, we have the other problem of the media and the package itself. And so the specific call out here is around the cumulative updates. So cumulative update is 1.6 gig in size. And oh, by the way, once you deploy it, there's no way to roll it back. So we were at that point, and business drivers were asking for more, and something had to change. So we came up with an immutable framework for SharePoint, which we call the common namespace. And with the common namespace, it essentially uses a feature of SharePoint to pin a URL to a site. And then that site will move between farms. And it starts to introduce some interesting scenarios. So maybe you have multiple data centers and like Target, and your regional use changes. Maybe it makes sense to move it. Or maybe you just want to split utilization of SharePoint across multiple data centers. Or maybe the importance of that site changes such that you need to stretch that farm across both data centers. Microsoft doesn't like you to do that. Maybe you have a team that has a budget that is willing to purchase a third-party component that only it needs. And it doesn't make sense to deploy that component to the 1,000 other sites that are in your environment. That scenario can be supported here. Or maybe you have a team that wants to test the next version of SharePoint, but you don't want to really deploy it to everybody, but you'd really like to give that team that upgrade experience and have them test it. And that works with if it's either the version of SharePoint or like a cumulative update or any sort of customization. And the scenarios kind of go on and on, really. But bottom line, the site moves to the farm based on business need and technical capability. And it really allows you to right-size your infrastructure. And so in order to do this, and given the configuration management complexities that you saw earlier, we needed to automate. And so Naomi and I had the privilege, with the help and support of our awesome engineering team, to go into the Target Dojo, which is an immersive learning environment for agile engineering practices. And they partner up the teams with agile coaches and then tackle certain initiatives. So our initiative was to automate SharePoint, and Naomi will tell the rest of the story.
So the first question that you really need to ask yourself, and that we needed to ask ourselves before we started down this journey, was, do we really have to? So we had to ask this question apart from our ego and our own preferences. Obviously, SharePoint was a tool that, as a SharePoint engineering team, we were pretty comfortable with. But we really needed to make sure that we had evaluated what was really the business need and make sure that this was the best tool to solve for that given the rest of the environment. Target is definitely moving in the direction of open source tools, but we still have a whole lot of infrastructure using SharePoint. So we needed to make sure that we thought through this, because frequently you can look at this awesome comic that I think totally explains. I think that by programming or by automating this thing, it's just going to take me a short little bit of effort and suddenly all of my problems are going to be resolved. But the reality is that maintaining infrastructure as code is still an active code base and requires care and feeding. So this is still a commitment, not just to automating that task, but also to continuing to iterate and refactor it to make sure that it stays alive. And the reality is that you really need to make sure that this is going to be worth your time. So in terms of how much time are we actually spending on these tasks and how long is it really going to take us to automate these things, we really needed to make sure that we had answers to these questions before we started just randomly writing code. So as soon as we went into the dojo, we did an activity known as value stream mapping, and we identified two primary value streams. The first one was building a new farm. When we walked that full value stream, we realized that we had 214 days of lead time to do 19.5 days of work. Not reflected in this is the fact that it also took a minimum of 8 engineers, and we had 5 significant conversations with other partners internally, okay? So we also then evaluated patching an existing farm. This particular process took 36 days of lead time to do 32 days of work, also required a small army of contractors, and it was really difficult for us to actually validate those applications after the patch had been deployed. On top of the build and patch value streams, we had our normal operational tasks. So we had 162 standalone developer boxes that we needed to maintain. We also have 800 non-user accounts that require password rotations. And we have a variety of certificates that need renewals on a random schedule, okay? So with this data, the case is pretty convincing. We needed to start automating, and there was a lot of power in this data. We could actually go back to our management teams and say, this is really where we're spending our time. We think that we should be able to start automating it. And they believed us. So, greenfield, right? Nobody's done this before. It's going to be fine. We're just going to jump in there and start automating all the things. Yeah, I didn't really feel that way, particularly not with a packaged software. So it frequently felt a little bit more like this. And so before we started on the journey, we wanted to make sure that our team was really on the same path as us, and that we were working together versus the problem, not necessarily versus each other. And so our strategy around that was really making sure that we kind of all checked our ego at the door. But also we changed the way we talked about the problem. It was an interesting puzzle. We talked about how we were going to make an impact not just on our daily tasks, but how we were actually going to bring value out to our end users, and how we were going to be able to spend more time working on things that we actually cared about, like innovation. So after we were all on the same page, we really decided we also needed to evaluate how the heck we were going to start automating this. With that, we had to throw all of the previous decisions that we made out on the table. And we need to make sure that we were exploring and reevaluating those. We also challenged all of the assumptions that we had made when we started arriving at those previous decisions. So there was a lot of conversation about, are we sure? Do we really need to do this? A great example of that is actually when we went into the dojo and first started thinking about automating, we decided that we were going to target patching an existing farm. After talking with our coaches, we really realized that this wasn't the value stream we needed to pay attention to. We actually needed to pay attention to that building a new farm value stream. Because patching an existing farm with SharePoint with that massive cumulative update patch, the inability to roll back, things like that, wasn't really the use case that we needed. It was way better for us to go ahead and implement immutable infrastructure and build that new farm, migrate the data over, and tear down the old one. So suddenly this value stream got a whole lot bigger, and we had to make sure that we really knew how we were going to tackle that. So we took a look at our legacy build scripts, and this is kind of a screenshot. We actually have pretty great build scripts for SharePoint. They're in version control, they're really robust, lots of time, energy from our team went into creating these. But the use case for our build scripts is really around provisioning. It's not about configuration management. So when we first thought that, hey, maybe we're just gonna dump this into a PowerShell block inside of a recipe and then put that in a cookbook and see what happens, not such a great idea. So we wiped the slate clean and we didn't use any of this. We also challenged a couple assumptions that Microsoft gave us. So one of the requirements from Microsoft is that all farms are domain joined. This wasn't a particular puzzle that we wanted to figure out at first. And so we looked at, like, if we just want a little skateboard of, a SharePoint farm just for our developers, do we really need to do a full domain join? The answer was no. We can create local accounts inside of an isolated environment and run it that way. If these little instances are going to be super short-lived, let's do it. So we did. The next tip that I have is really about making sure that you understand how to apply the industry patterns to your product. This is indiscriminate of tools. It's much more important to understand the context of the pattern of continuous delivery and how to actually start thinking about that as it relates to your product, rather than trying to figure out how am I going to apply Chef to my product. Okay, so you have to think about that full pipeline, not just about a specific tool that you've heard about that you think is really interesting. On the flip side, it's equally as important to really know your product. So you need to be able to see, how is it that I can actually twist the product or implement a feature set inside of that product that allows me to apply these patterns to something like SharePoint. This can actually be really hard with SharePoint. For one, there's a black box around that source code. So thankfully, we have the pretty robust PowerShell snap-ins that allow us to interact with it, but we don't always have access to everything. We also have 3 layers of configuration management that Ron alluded to, but we also have end-user modifications that we need to adjust for. And so configuration management in particular for SharePoint felt pretty complicated, almost impossible. But we really took a look at how we were going to do this inside of Chef. And so we first decided how far down we wanted to configure. We could have gone all the way down to the end user modifications. We decided that we were going to step back and we were going to go to the web application level. And we could continue to iterate on this, but just to get things up and running, we decided that just to the web application level was actually going to give our teams quite a bit of value. We also decided that we were going to leverage DSC pretty heavily. So our order of operations of what we were going to use, native chef resources first, wherever we could. Then we were going to use the DSC modules for more SharePoint or Microsoft-specific implementations or functionality. And then as a last resort, if we couldn't find what we needed in those areas, we were either going to write our own DSC module, or we were going to wrap some PowerShell commandlets that we already had in a PowerShell block and then go ahead and run that. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about DSC. I think if you want more information about that, there are a lot of great webinars out there, specifically from Steve Moraski. There's a few other sessions about DSC here. But this just kind of highlights these. The top one is a native DSC resource, and this bottom one is actually that same resource as applied inside of a chef recipe. So this is actually installing the prerequisites for SharePoint. And this is actually from one of our cookbooks. So one of the things that we really learned for trying to manage 19 farms with one chef cookbook is that it's really important to make sure that you have small, reusable, attribute-driven recipes. Specifically with this is a little code block that actually shows SharePoint services that we want to have started on a server. So inside of that farm, Ron talked about a couple different roles that different servers can have. Inside of that SharePoint product, we start different services depending on what type of role they're fulfilling. We use this same code block for each of those server roles, okay? And I just pass through which services I want started. So you can see that the role on the left is a specialized app server known as Central Admin, and this is kind of the master of a SharePoint farm. You can see that the started services attribute override has quite a bit more services than the web server on the right. You can also see in the run list that this is coming from one cookbook. Okay, so we have one primary cookbook that we use to actually install and configure base SharePoint. However, we have on the specialized app server, the third one down is the create farm recipe, which only runs on that particular central admin role. And the one on the right has the join farm. So that is how we kind of have that master and puppet separation without actually have a separate cookbook. Okay. We also worked on continuous delivery. So discovered as someone who writes a lot of PowerShell code, wasn't really exposed to writing unit tests or integration tests before we started down this journey. And writing the tests was something that we actually discovered took a lot longer than writing the actual recipe code, and particularly writing good tests. I chose this one because this is really challenging for me. It actually has 2 PS credential calls, which was a lot of fun to try and mock. But this was really critical to our success, but also to giving us confidence that the farms were going to be configured the way that we needed and the way that we wanted them. It also gave our product teams a whole lot more confidence that they were going to get something that was consistent. This was something that we could actually sell them on to say like, hey, look, our builds are green. We have these processes. Here you can actually have visibility into the test as well as the output of the test beyond just, well, we think it works. And we think the server is the way you want it, I swear. So we actually implemented a full CI/CD pipeline. We use Jenkins for this, but everything is defined in code all the way from the jobs that we're running through to the actual deployment to the server. I have a few other examples of some of the industry patterns that we're starting to apply here. Abstraction and containerization. This was actually a really fun one for us. We're still working with the development teams on this, but we have a lot of customized code that has been created for our different farms. And of course, it's all different. But SharePoint has this functionality known as the provider hosted add-in. And so what it means is that you can have your custom app or custom dev that is going to use SharePoint deployed on a completely separate server. And so this type of abstraction was actually really critical for us maintaining the, I guess, the isolation of that SharePoint code and making sure that the app custom code was not interacting and interfering with that functionality running. So the developers then just consume the SharePoint services through the APIs. And by putting those apps inside of containers, we can actually run them on whatever OS we want. We don't have to actually only run them on top of a Windows box, which suddenly opened up SharePoint development and consuming SharePoint as a platform to more than just a traditional dev group that has been using it. We're also working on auto-scaling. We have environments where maybe they aren't used for most of the year, and they're only really used right around Black Friday. So we've been working on figuring out what those metrics would be for scaling up and scaling down. Also been working with our development teams on the automated acceptance tests. And this is actually really critical for the patch scenarios where we deploy that new farm and move the data over, and we want to ensure that the application is functioning as they desire. And so they have actually been writing more of those tests, and then we're incorporating those into our pipeline. The big win, though, is the self-service. And so this was something that we were able to offer our developers, that they could provision their own dev boxes on their own. We actually completely wrote our infrastructure team out of the developer box provisioning process, which was great. They are using a smaller product key, so it expires after like 90 days. And they have to provision a new one, so they've definitely been doing a lot more of like committing their stuff to code. But at the same time, they know that at least their builds of their environments are going to be consistent with what we're doing inside of production. My last point is really to make sure that you ask for what you need. It's really easy to feel like you're the first person going into this space, and that can be a little daunting. And you might be the first person going into that space inside of your technology. But there are still people that you can ask and lessons that you can learn from other areas. There sometimes isn't a lot of support for packaged software inside of the DevOps community, as we kind of alluded to earlier. But there is a really robust community for a lot of these other products. Specifically with SharePoint, there's a really great dev community, and there's a lot of IT pros that we could reach out to and ask questions about, specifically the provider-hosted add-in model and how they were implementing that. We are also able to leverage the communities in general. So for example, this is my favorite example. This is that lovely prerequisite installer that I showed earlier. And my arrow is pointing to this reboot action, reboot now. SharePoint prereqs, for some reason, require 2 reboots. So when this DSC resource, the Chef resource, was created, it didn't have a way to detect or take action if a reboot was pending. And so we reached out to the Chef community engineers and said, like, we have to be able to figure out, after we banged our heads against the wall for about 3 days, and we're trying to figure out what the heck does this exit code mean. We reached out and realized that, hey, maybe you just need to reboot this because it's Windows, and of course. So that was when we reached out to the Chef community engineers and said, hey, we need to be able to detect if a reboot is pending, and then tell it what type of action we want to have taken as a result of that. So Steve Maraski actually wrote this for us, and we were really, really thankful when it went in. So we also heavily used the SharePoint DSC PowerShell repo. I can't say enough great things about the maintainers of this repo. We were really able to work with them on submitting issues, talking to them about functionality that we were going to be needing, and they actually responded really quickly to us. And we're really interested in how we were using it. Even though we were working with Chef and not DSC native, they wanted to make sure that what they were developing was something that was going to add value for us. And so this allowed us to actually stay focused on activities that were going to add value to Target, and while still providing them the feedback so they could actually add value and improve their own service and their own product. So I didn't actually submit pull request on this one, but it was really great to just start developing that relationship and leveraging that community. And I think it's really important to make sure that you actually ask all the questions. You have to be humble in this type of experience. I learned that it was really important that I asked all of the dumb questions. And even when I was asking all of the dumb questions, I was learning a whole lot more, and I was learning it a lot faster than if I was just trying to beat my head against a wall and only do this on my own. Even to the internal teams who were working on bespoke Linux platforms and with other Java apps and such, I could still learn a lot from them about, hey, how did you solve this problem or this type of problem? Not necessarily saying, hey, so I'm automating SharePoint, what would you suggest? Because I usually got a really strange look. But I do want to say that just because someone hasn't done it before, or because other people don't know why something happens, doesn't mean that you have to accept that, okay? Be curious, try it. What's the worst that's going to happen? Particularly when we were playing inside of local development, like, I'm just going to have to reimage my machine, or I'll just destroy that, that particular development box. That's okay. So just try it and test it. So what happened, right? If you remember this awesome value stream, 214 days of lead time to do 19.5 days of work. Well, we actually got that down to 14 days of lead time to do 2 days worth of work. We still have one particular process that requires a manual intervention, but I'm excited to say that that team is actually working on providing us a mechanism for improving that. So hopefully we'll be able to shrink this down to even shorter. The other thing that I will say is that we've also reduced a lot of our operational tasks. For example, those 162 developer boxes, we don't have to manage those anymore. And so that gave us a lot more space to actually allow our team to start working and developing new innovations and actually automating more of this. So what's next? We're actually working right now on open sourcing our cookbook. So we'll show you where you can actually we'll show you the link and what you can watch so you can see when it goes out, but that is something that we are actively working on. And we have a few other automation targets that kind of talked about earlier, but as it relates to really leveraging those apps inside of the containers and making sure that we're able to consume different. That's fun. So we can actually consume more. Super distracting. Super cool. Whatever. We've got other automation targets, and we'll work on that. But the cool thing is that we are going to be transitioning this cookbook over to our development teams. And they are really going to start owning this and running with it. So we're going to be able to actually move on to do some other fun stuff, which I'm kind of really excited. So if you remember, I really like to write myself out of the processes so I can go on to something different. So this is a huge win for us. But the other thing is really what we learned. So I learned that these are important patterns that we need to apply to all software. Wherever possible. These aren't concepts just for the big money-making apps, whether it's a mobile app or a website or something like that. It's actually really important to the culture inside of your organization to make sure that you can apply these concepts to packaged softwares or softwares that are maybe running behind the scenes. It makes the organization more efficient, and really kind of helps build your engineering talent and makes people excited to work with you. The other thing we really learned was feedback loops are super critical. Our developer team wasn't able to work with us during the first push towards building these cookbooks and actually developing this automation. And it was kind of hard to get validation for that build process and for that cookbook. And so when we did get feedback from them, we actually did need to do some significant refactoring. However, in subsequent efforts, they have been able to be a part of that process. And so that feedback loop has definitely tightened. And it's been really cool to see how much farther and faster we can go when we're actually partnered with them. This also doesn't change the perception of the product. So when I'm at like DevOps meetups, or even here when I was talking to a couple of people and they're asking like, hey, what are you talking about? I got the, oh, and I'm sorry. But at the same time, I was really encouraged by people inside of the community to come and give this presentation and to submit the talk. So it's kind of cool to at least start seeing that change of, hey, you actually have an interesting story to tell here. So.
And I think it also just aligns with what the keynote was about today about the open sourcing and then the speed. We're trying to open source the cookbook, but then also we leverage that PowerShell DSC community like open source, submitting issues and having those guys work on them. Yeah. So like I said, resources, definitely keep an eye on the Target Tech blog as well as just our GitHub. We're going to be publishing that cookbook out on Target's GitHub page. And I will say, I'm going to throw a pitch for Trevor's talk, actually. So adding Windows to your kitchen. We bashed our heads against really adding Windows support to Test Kitchen and figuring out how to interact with that. And so they're going to be talking a little bit more about some of the common challenges, so definitely one to check out. But I do want to say thank you. So obviously to my team for giving us space, but also to anybody who's answered a question for us, whether it was the SharePoint DSC maintainers or the Chef community cookbooks. And if you're interested in what we're doing at Target, or if you have questions for us, you can stop by our booth, or contact us directly. So thanks. Uh-oh.
So we have a few minutes for questions, for some Q&A.
So how long did it take to build the cookbook? When did you start, and how far along are you now, would you say?
So we started in November of 2015. Active development probably took us about 6 months to really get it up to a point where we were able to have teams start really leveraging it for their full development efforts. I think now we're actually in a really good spot. Trying to think like how mature we would say it is, but
yeah. I would add to that. We had a really small team,
yeah.
Quite frankly. There was about 3 of us that were able to work on it. We felt like if we could have partnered better with our devs or got a few more engineers to help us, we thought the sweet spot was probably about maybe 5, 6 engineers working on this. So, but it was a team of 3 really.
Yep.
So.
Yeah. Sure.
When you talk about the 14 days lead time and 2 days of work, is that? Sorry. When you talk about the 14 days lead time and the 2 days of work, is that to rebuild your immutable infrastructure when you make a change?
Yep.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So for this project and for other projects where you involve other teams within your corporation, do you find it that it's easier to educate them and then leave them to create the cookbook, or do you guys actually work at building the entire cookbook, learn about their application, and then end up writing the whole thing and testing it? Like, how do you associate, like, you do this part, we'll handle this part? Or did you guys just to say every team go get your own chef person? No.
There's, particularly inside of Target, we have that immersive engineering environment called the dojo, where people go down there to to be on a challenge. It's a 30-day kind of effort that focuses on automation. And so depending on what type of team you are, if you are in a portfolio or working on an app that my team supports, we really try and send one of our engineers down there to help them learn how to consume either from our cookbooks, to help point them at cookbooks that would help them, to educate them about consuming our services, making sure that we're really working with them to kind of both teach them about Chef, but I mean, we've got tech coaches that help with that, but really to help teach them about how we as an infrastructure team supporting corporate systems and marketing can help them with the nuances and the specifics inside of that area.
And I would just add, the closer that you're aligned with the product owner and getting them involved, the better. So.
Mm-hmm.
How valuable was it to understand and learn PowerShell going into chef automation?
For Microsoft products, actually, it was helpful from the perspective of really being able to read and interpret the DSC resources. I knew quite a bit of PowerShell before we started. I know Ron also knows quite a bit of PowerShell. But I don't know that I would necessarily say that it's a requirement. I think particularly with the SharePoint one, it is really well documented. Their styles in terms of being able to interpret, like, these are the parameters that you need to pass in. They've got great wiki documentation, that kind of thing. There's a lot of support there, and you can frequently find help related to it, but it was helpful for me to be able to say, this is the specific commandlet that it's going to be executing, and these are the parameters that it's passing through. And I was familiar with those because I'm familiar with the PowerShell snap-in for SharePoint.
And it's also helpful, I think, particularly in the test cases where
Yeah.
you're writing PowerShell to essentially query the machine to see if it's in the correct state. So
Yeah.
that comes helpful. Yeah.
This will be the last one.
You
The
can-
pressure. What did you do with like custom web parts and all the other stuff that kind of comes along as baggage with SharePoint? Did you put those off into some kind of data bag or something that you're able to kind of reference into your project?
Yeah, so I mean, I would say that we're iterating on this right now. What we did focus on is really that app model first. So there was a cookbook, I think an early cookbook that's developed around deploying solutions and such.
Yep.
So there's a pattern, a thought process. We've not really iterated on that to that point yet.
But the theory is that there is a cookbook that allows us to actually say, pass through as essentially attributes and say, okay, go and get this particular solution and deploy it to this server farm, that kind of thing. And so we can actually still pass that through.
And all in the same cookbook, attribute driven.
Yep.
Yep.
All right, Ron, Naomi, thank you again on behalf of the community. Can we give them one more round of applause?